It is a nationwide crisis impacting every one of us. Opioids, legal and illegal, they're addictive and deadly.
This epidemic is a national health emergency.
Lives are being lost by the tens of thousands every year to painkiller abuse and heroin. The financial impact is in the billions. Opioid issues knife across each state, endangering every American city, suburb, and town, all cut deeply by the opioid epidemic. Eric Bolling lost his son to the synthetic opioid fentanyl at his Colorado University.
We must commit to removing the stigma of shame that comes with addiction and helping change public opinion so that people find evidence-based treatment before it's too late.
Stand up and fight the opioid crisis now. This is a Your Voice, Your Future town hall. Opioids, a national crisis. Now, Eric Bolling.
Well, it's been called an epidemic, a crisis, and it's rapidly intensified across the nation in recent years. Thank you for joining us for this Your Voice, Your Future roundtable discussion on opioids and national crisis. President Trump recently addressed the opioid epidemic this week during a speech at the American Farm Bureau Federation's 100th annual convention. Take a listen.
In 2017, drugs killed over 70,000 of our fellow citizens. Think of that. That's like a football stadium loaded up. And imposed costs on our society in excess of $700 billion.
$700 billion is a staggering number. This is another staggering fact. North Carolina is now the second in the nation for the highest increase in opioid deaths, according to the Centers for Disease Control. Second in the nation. So if you or someone you know needs help, we have a list of resources posted on our website, WLOS.com. Along with national resources, we have links and phone numbers for every Western North Carolina county and in the upstate South Carolina area. We begin tonight's discussion with a look at what's being done to fight the opioid epidemic. Stephanie Santosi reports.
New year, same problem. A crisis on the rise in North Carolina, and the numbers are startling.
We lose more lives every year to an opioid overdose than any other type of accidental death. It's about 5 people every day.
Attorney General Josh Stein says in order to fight this, it's going to require a comprehensive approach.
We have to work on all fronts, and frankly, we all have to work together. It means people coming together who don't necessarily have a history of working together.
Historically, prescription opioids have been a major driver of this epidemic. However, according to the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, illicit drugs are now contributing to this problem in increasing numbers.
It's hard for me to have any sympathy for that type of activity.
Lowell Griffin is the new sheriff in town in Henderson County, but he says there's nothing new about how they're tackling this opioid problem.
They're drug dealers, okay? And we are going to continually and passionately pursue these dealers.
Heroin or other synthetic narcotics like fentanyl were involved in nearly 80% of unintentional opioid deaths in North Carolina in 2017.
If we can decrease the amount of consumers looking for the drugs on the street, then that's going to help decrease, stem the flow, just because it decreases that demand.
It's not just that. Sheriff Griffin believes community partnerships and continuing to build on relationships will also help end this crisis.
We're going to stay in the fight. We're going to keep battling this.
In 2017, in the state of North Carolina, there were nearly 12,000 hospitalizations and over 25,000 emergency department visits due to medication and drug poisonings. Here at Mission, they see between 25 to 40 overdose patients a day.
The demographic today is widespread. It's young and old.
Mission Hospital's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. William Hathaway, says in hospitals in Western North Carolina, the crisis is just getting worse.
60 to 70% for patients who even complete a treatment program, they can have relapse of their substance abuse problems.
Hathaway says much of this started when medical professionals began overprescribing controlled substances.
We were misled in being told that it wasn't as addictive as we thought it was.
They've now learned how to control that supply, but the problems haven't changed because patients are learning how to get the drugs from other places, something all 3 of these men want to see end in the new year.
The single most effective thing the state of North Carolina could do if we were serious about fighting the opioid epidemic would be to simply accept the federal government's offer to expand Medicaid.
Stephanie Sanastasi, News 13.
And you just saw him, and right now North Carolina's top law enforcement officer, Attorney General Josh Stein, is with us for tonight's discussion. Thank you for being here with us, General Stein. So that last point that you made in that piece, you talk about increasing Medicaid.
Yeah.
That may not be popular with a lot of people in North Carolina.
It has to do with what the sheriff said at the beginning of the show. This epidemic is both a supply problem and a demand problem. If we can stem the demand, if we can reduce the demand, then the drugs won't have anywhere to go. There are tens of thousands of North Carolinians today struggling from opioid addiction. We need to help them get the health care that they need so that they're no longer addicted.
Well, talk to us a little bit about that. What does expanding Medicaid and Medicare, specifically Medicaid, what does that do to help stem the rise and increase of addiction?
Absolutely. The First Lady in her remarks talked about the need to have evidence-based treatment. Well, the best kind of treatment for somebody with addiction is to have medication-assisted therapy. That's where you get the counseling in combination with a drug like buprenorphine or methadone, something that helps you deal with the intense cravings, the overpowering cravings for that drug. Medication costs money, and so folks need health insurance in order to pay for their medication. That's what Medicaid.
Is there a situation in North Carolina where people may be struggling with addiction, they want to get help, but they can't afford it?
100% happens.
And so what do? They can't. Can they not go into an emergency room and get help?
Well, the emergency room will help stabilize them from an overdose so that they're no longer dying. But as soon as they're stable, sadly, the emergency departments just release them into the community where whatever was driving them to overdose in the first place, that addiction is going to rear its ugly head again.
You know what strikes me? You're the Attorney General. You're the top law enforcement official in the state of North Carolina, yet you're not talking about the enforcement side. You're talking about the awareness side, the addiction side, and getting people help. Does that trickle down throughout all of law enforcement under you?
Well, I'm not responsible for all law enforcement, but there is a
aren't you?
Well, I am the Attorney General and the top lawyer, state's lawyer, but I don't control what a chief of police does or what a sheriff does. They're independent. But what is happening is a much wider acceptance that law enforcement has to have a different approach. Because if you arrest somebody for consuming drugs or for engaging in property crime to feed an addiction, they go to jail, they're addicted. They get out of jail, they're still addicted. They are going to do whatever it was that led them to being incarcerated in the first place because the addiction is still in them. So law enforcement has a new approach, which is let's get people, as to the extent possible, out of criminal justice and into health care.
Some states have a rule, have a law on the books that says if let's say you're two 16-year-old kids, one is overdosing in front of you and there are drugs on both of you.
Yeah.
If the one who's not overdosing calls the law enforcement, they're not going to go to jail, even if they're caught with drugs on them.
North Carolina as well.
That's a very important step. Was it hard to get your law enforcement people on board with that?
Well, actually, it was the legislature. And this is, I want to say, this is an issue that cuts across party lines. North Carolina, as you know, is very intense politically. I'm a Democrat and the legislature is Republican, but it was a Republican General Assembly that passed a Good Samaritan law that does exactly what you described.
Give us the specifics of that law.
Exactly what you said. Two people are in a room, one of them overdoses, the other has drugs in their possession. If that person calls EMS and to save the life of their person who overdosed, they cannot be arrested for whatever's in their possession. The idea is to give them the encouragement to save lives.
And so there are no arrests. There's no criminal activity. There's no, if they're underage, do they report to their parents?
I'm sure that it will be reported to the parents because law enforcement is called, EMS is called, insurance will be triggered. So yes.
The schools?
No, there's no reason why the school would be notified.
You know, so I want to talk a little bit about, we went out on the street and we asked people, what are your questions? What are you concerned about? I think this is really important that people get, one of the things that you take away from this is, number one, if you know someone or you need help, you can get help. We have plenty of opportunity, plenty of resources here available today to get your help or a friend's help or a cousin's help or a coworker's help or a parent's help. But the other thing is, you need to know you're not going to go to jail if you seek help.
That's correct.
All right, let's take a look at this. Court documents filed yesterday in Massachusetts show Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, told people during its launch party in the 1990s that, get this, a, quote, blizzard of prescriptions would follow. Well, we're going to have to see what viewers wanted to ask our panel, specifically the Attorney General. This gentleman had an excellent question that relates quite closely to Purdue Pharma. Take a listen.
Hi, my name is Jim Hurst. I live in Asheville, North Carolina. Members of my family have died from the opioid crisis, and yet I see no accountability for Big Pharma that has promoted really destructive prescription policies. Will we ever see any accountability for the people who have caused this casualty?
So, General Stein, what about that? What about the Big Pharma, specifically Purdue Pharma? Aside from a big blizzard of prescriptions that were going to follow the release of OxyContin in the 90s, recently, Purdue Pharma said they cut their sales force in half, and they took a victory lap for that. I'm trying to think, why does a pharmaceutical company making OxyContin or other opioids, why do they need a sales force? Shouldn't it be a doctor asking them for this, we need this much, rather than a bunch of salespeople telling the doctor, hey, if you sell all these, you know, you may get a golf vacation?
United States is one of only 2 countries in the entire world where Big Pharma can advertise drugs to consumers. And there's no question that that has been a primary driver of this epidemic in the United States, here in North Carolina. I have sued Purdue Pharma because their marketing was to induce doctors, and in fact they created financial incentives to doctors to prescribe this drug to people, which then led to them being addicted. And then when they could no longer get another prescription, they would go to the street to take heroin. Of course. Laced with fentanyl, which kills them.
This reminds me exactly of Big Tobacco. When Big Tobacco went under the massive scrutiny, they got sued and they lost a multi-hundreds of billions of dollar lawsuit. And then what they were told to do, they can't advertise anymore on television. They can't do certain things anymore. Maybe it's time for Big Pharma to be, listen, I'm a free marketeer. I'm a libertarian. The market will dictate what things companies can and can't do. However, when life or death is on the line, I think this is an area where maybe we want to have some reins on Big Pharma.
Well, the one certainty is that they can't misrepresent to the public or to doctors about their medication. And there are people who are addicted today, there are people who are dead today because of what Purdue Pharma did. That's why I sued them. I sued another company called Insys Therapeutics for, they would actually give kickbacks to doctors based on how much
blows me
they
away.
prescribed.
Based on how much they prescribe. What does that do? Incentivizes a doctor to give maybe a 30-day supply, maybe a 60-day supply. What happens when a 60-day supply of an opioid is in a parent's medicine cabinet?
The extras get taken by a kid and put on the street.
Put on the street, or used, or taken, or in some cases become
and for some people,
addicts.
And for some people, all it takes is one prescription to become addicted. And so there's been a certain recklessness.
So is it time to talk about whether or not pharmaceuticals producing opioids should be even allowed to have a sales force?
Well, that was one of the arguments we made to Purdue Pharma before they actually made the decision to cut their sales force, was that to stop all marketing of it. So I think that is something that we should look at.
How closely are we looking into, and I know this there's a national push to have doctors way more accountable for the opioids they prescribe. Is that enough? And what are we doing? What is North Carolina doing in that regard?
Well, we passed a law, and my colleague and good friend, Senator Davis, is going to be on in a moment to help talk about it. But we passed a bill called the STOP Act, which sets a limit on the number of pills that a doctor can prescribe for acute pain, as distinct from chronic pain, meaning if you break your arm or you have your wisdom teeth taken out. No more 30-day prescriptions, no more 60-day prescription. You're capped at 5.
5 days.
5 days.
And then you have to go back.
If you need them, but the thing is no one ever needs more.
Is it entered into a national database or just a North Carolina database?
We are in a North Carolina database that has relationship with other states around the country.
Because there are people who are they're just searching for pills, doctor shopping, and they'll go to another doctor or another state. In this case, you can jump over to South Carolina, but you have a information share with South Carolina?
We do, and Virginia.
And Virginia, great. All right, next. Your chances of dying from an opioid overdose has gone up. The shocking comparison you just will not believe. And we bring in North Carolina Republican Senator Jim Davis to talk about the efforts currently on the books to curb the epidemic. We will be right back. AG will stay with us.
Anna was 20 years old when she passed from an opiate overdose.
Julie Honeycutt still feels the pain from her daughter's death.
The last time we saw Anna was a Friday afternoon. She was doing really great. My husband had taken her to the doctor. He took her to lunch. They had a good lunch. The doctor was really proud of the progress she was making. He kissed her goodbye.
That night in 2010 was the last time Anna's family would see her alive.
The next morning we got a call that she wasn't responsive.
Honeycutt now works tirelessly as director of Hope RX, which focuses on helping those with prescription drug abuse problems.
We know that we're down on opioids themselves as far as prescriptions. I think the problem that we're starting to see is the fentanyl-laced opiates that we're finding on the streets, and we're going to have to address the way that they're coming into our community.
Jimmy Brissy, head of emergency services in Henderson County, says his paramedics see what happens when fentanyl comes into our community firsthand.
Some of the calls are requiring more and more drugs to counteract these overdoses.
We have 4.
And with more calls, these paramedics face more danger.
Some of them are very difficult to control. Sometimes it happens in a parking lot. Sometimes it may happen in a questionable home.
But none of them question fighting this epidemic, just trying to save lives.
We treat everybody with the best care that we can and hope and pray that they can get the help and recovery that they need.
Welcome back and thanks for joining us. This is a crisis that involves the entire nation, and not just local lawmakers, but our policymakers in Washington are also working on ways to curb the opioid epidemic. During today's Connect to Congress, we asked lawmakers what they're doing to help stop the epidemic and issues they hope to tackle in the near future.
We continue to work to put funding in this crisis that's taken place. We've made it harder for the prescriptions to be given out. We've limited the size of dosage that can be given out. We've treated it more like a controlled substance. We're putting pharma on notice. We've allowed the doctors to have more authority over what they're prescribing. So for Congress, we're trying to bring all the aspects together. There's just not one single piece of legislation that's going to put this genie back in the bottle, but there's a lot of them that's helping push it back towards.
Where do the ingredients come from? They don't come in between ports of entry. If you look at the latest DA report, they come in through bridges, and therefore we have to put canines, personnel, technology, x-ray machines to stop that. And a lot of it also comes in through packages, mail. So we have to be, stopping this. Some of it will come from China and other places. So we gotta be smart on how we go after this.
I think we also need to look at the way in which these drugs come into our country. It's not just a matter of overprescription, which the health industry is adapting to right now, but in a lot of cases, these drugs are being mailed directly. In many cases from Asia, being sent directly to the country through the mail. We need to develop the capabilities to deal with that. And right now we don't have those capabilities, and that's going to be a generational challenge.
Well, we've been talking with North Carolina Attorney General Josh Stein about fighting the opioid epidemic. Now, Republican Senator Jim Davis is with us as well. These two men have put in so much work to pass legislation to combat the opioid crisis in North Carolina, including both the STOP Act and the HOPE Act. Senator Davis, tell us a little bit about those two pieces of legislation. Start with the STOP Act.
Well, the STOP Act really began its formulation when I was contacted by my good friend Josh. Before he took office, actually, he knew I was the go-to guy in the Senate regarding substance abuse, and so he invited me to collaborate with him and his office and his staff to develop the STOP Act. And our first effort was to stem the flow of the prescriptions, because we knew that like 72% of all the heroin users get started with prescription opioids. And so the STOP Act was an effort to minimize the prescriptions that were available. And so, as he mentioned, we reduced acute pain prescriptions to 5 days, the initial prescription, and post-surgery to 7 days. And then after that, more pain medication was available if needed. And it also mandated that prescribers used the controlled substance reporting system. And that way we know who's prescribing what to whom and from where they're getting the prescription drugs. And it was successful. It passed unanimously in both houses of the legislature.
Yeah, this is what really is encouraging, if I can use that word, of all this, is that this is a bipartisan effort. I mean, it really crosses both party lines as to people wanting to bring legislation to help solve some of this problem. I mean, it's ridiculous. The 72,000 people who died last year of drug overdoses, most of them being opioid overdoses, that's like, you know, you're talking 200 people a day dying, and we use this example all the time. It's a 737 filled to capacity flying into a mountainside every single day. At some point you go, wow, we need to really work on this. It's encouraging to see legislatures on both sides of the aisle coming together to do this. Someone posted this question on Facebook regarding the STOP Act. Take a look at this. It says, we have the STOP Act, but many prescribers and pharmacies in our area are not abiding by it. What is the state going to do to enforce it? AG, can I go to you and ask you?
Absolutely. If somebody knows about a doctor who is not abiding by those restrictions, they should let the medical board know, let local law enforcement know, who can pass it on to the medical board.
Call your local law enforcement. How do they let the medical board know?
Well, the medical board has a number. I don't know it, but just search for North Carolina Medical Board online, and they oversee the doctors. And if doctors are not complying with the law, they have licensure issues. And if their overprescribing is leading to death, then they can be criminally charged.
Okay, we're gonna look up that number and get it to you before the end of this segment. And again, so what is are we pulling medical licenses if they're overprescribing?
Correct.
What are your thoughts on is this enough?
Well, it's a starting point, and I think that we've had good buy-in from all stakeholders. That's one of the advantages that we had in getting unanimous approval of the STOP Act, is we brought in all the stakeholders. Josh's staff and the legislative staff were the main drivers of this effort, but we got stakeholders, all stakeholders involved. We said, here's the problem, how do we fix it? And so we brought them in, rather than getting shoved down their throats from the top down. We brought them into the conversation so that we could get good buy-in and
not have
unintended consequences.
And I think I'm going to do this with everyone. We have a big show today. We have a lot of guests who are going to talk at various levels of law enforcement, legislature, policy, also people giving help, help providers. Let's talk about the stigma of opioid abuse and what it really means. I think there are people out there who probably think when you hear opioid abuse or opioid addiction, you think of someone with a needle and shooting heroin into their arm. That's not the face of this anymore, is it?
No, it's not. And I lived in a bubble. I was not aware of the magnitude of this problem. Your guest that you're going to have on later, Chief Bill Hollingsed, is one that got me started on this journey. And I was just really ignorant of the magnitude of the problem.
What did you think it was?
Just what you described. I thought it was people in the gutter, shooting up. And I found out otherwise. It transcends all barriers, all demographics.
Absolutely.
Yes,
but
all
demographics. Sometimes people end up in the gutter with a needle in their arm. Because if you're addicted to the pills and you can no longer afford the pills, heroin sadly is cheap. It's cheap on the street.
Talk to me about that. What happens?
They will then go to, I talked to this one young man, very inspiring. He was a student at UNC Greensboro in his early 20s. He said he lost 4 years out of his life, went to jail, tattoos. He said, since I've been clean, I have not had the single impulse to commit any crimes. But when I was addicted, I would have sold my own mother to get the heroin that I needed to feed this chemical beast.
So I want to jump in here, guys, because I promised you we would do this. We have that number for reporting and this is really important, reporting a doctor who's over-prescribing. A lot of times these doctors they're not even prescribing any pain. They're just literally taking a fee to get someone to come in, $100, whatever it is, or a copay, and then sending someone out with a prescription. Do we have the number? Can we put up? There it is on the screen. There's a number on the screen. If you know a doctor who you think is abusing his prescription pad by giving out opioids, you may save a life by just making that phone call to that group right now. General, is that what they're supposed to do?
Absolutely. I will say that the medical doctors, the medical society, they've been very constructive. They realized they were sold a bill of goods.
Can I add this? And I apologize for cutting you off. 100% agree. Yeah. We have the best medical community in the world, the best. But there are bad apples in every single group. I do not disagree. And that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about a doctor you don't like. We're talking about someone who's putting someone's life at risk by prescribing.
Absolutely. And we're talking, there are a few bad actors in every profession. And there's a lot of money associated with this. And so that people that get in trouble, financially, they can, on a moment of weakness, can overprescribe and sell drugs on the street. And there are bad actors in every profession. Okay. But I agree that we brought in all the stakeholders, and we had incredible buy-in by all those stakeholders to come to a good place with the STOP Act.
Right. So what we do is we're going around the country. We're traveling cities around the country, and what we're trying to do is talk to people. We want to know what they are concerned about, what questions they have. And we met up with a few of these people, who spoke with several people leading up to this exact roundtable. Several had questions that seemed to have a common thread. Take a listen.
Hi, my name is Joanne Dykes. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina. So my question is, how do we get long-term treatment for people that maybe can't afford it? Long-term treatment that could be more effective in treating addictions, and especially opioid addictions, to actually get some results in getting people off the drugs and out of the jail system.
My name is Dudley Wilson, and I'd like to know why we can't get more funding for the opioid crisis, especially for treatment.
I'm Jesse Woods. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, and I would like to know why they put so much money into putting people in jail and instead of spending that money on treatment for people on opiates.
So let me ask you, General. Yeah. They are concerned about where's the money going to come from for getting in the long-term treatment. I think we addressed it a little bit in the first block, but go ahead.
The U.S. Congress has, in the last 2 years ago and last year, appropriated substantial sums of money.
$6 billion.
That's all to the good. But if you're a healthcare provider and you're deciding to make capital investments, do I want to open up a facility? Do I want to hire a physician assistant? You're not going to do that with a one-time grant from the government. You need to know that there's going to be a cash flow to sustain that enterprise on a going forward basis. That's why insurance pays for healthcare in the United States. That's why the North Carolina legislature this year needs to expand Medicaid. We have 500,000 North Carolinians who don't have health insurance.
Mm-hmm. So talk to me about this, guys. Right now, insurance pays for it. Where's the pull on the $6 billion? By the way, if I'm not mistaken, it's $6 billion for 19 and $6 billion, another $6 billion for 2020. Where does North Carolina pull? How do you make your case to the feds?
Well, that money goes to our, we call them LME MCOs. They're the mental health providers for low-income people without insurance. And we had money a couple years ago. We got $31 million over 2 years, and that helped about 3,000 people. And that is wonderful. I will never complain. But when we have 70, 80, 90,000 people addicted to opioids, it's a drop in the bucket. Mm-hmm. The only way
we need 20 times the number.
We need sums beyond that. That's why we need health care.
And are they listening, Senator?
Yes, we are listening. My good friend Josh would like for us to expand Medicaid. Medicaid expenditures were out of control. We had cost overruns of $500 million a year. And we've now got that under control. And I personally am in favor of expanding Medicaid with work requirements associated with it. But we have to get these individuals long-term care. treatment for opioid addiction could be 5 years, could be 10 years,
Yeah,
it could
it's
be
not
a
a
lifetime.
90-day. It's not a 90-day deal.
It could be a lifetime.
Could be a lifetime.
The sequel to the STOP Act was the HOPE Act, and that appropriated $10 million additional in treatment money starting this next fiscal year. And that's not the end of it. We'll have more money. We have to. It's a modern day plague that we have to address.
It's a national health crisis in every single state we've gone to, including North Carolina. Who's going to say no to additional funding for recovery?
Just today, I reached an agreement with a new foundation that's being created in Western North Carolina called the Dogwood Health Trust. And they, as a result of our agreement, is going to dedicate $25 million over 5 years to this crisis. So that will help, but we really need a long term.
What's the number? Give me a number. What's the real number?
Probably a $100 billion problem.
Nationally?
Yes.
What about North Carolina?
Probably $5 billion.
$5 billion, and you're at a handful of millions.
$10 million.
A handful of millions. Well, for the first time on record, get this, the odds of you dying from an accidental opioid overdose are greater than you dying from a car crash. The National Safety Council is warning against a new threat to your family. As Catherine Van reports, overdosing is now the 5th leading cause of death in the United States.
Even if you don't think you know somebody that's on opioids or on heroin, you do.
For years, Terry Joy says she was in denial about her stepson, Steven. She hasn't seen him in almost a year.
He's got so much potential, but this drug has got him.
His drug of choice is heroin, but she says he's also addicted to opioids. She says 2 of her young neighbors died from overdoses and worries her son could be next.
I don't think my husband could handle it. And then I don't think I could handle my husband.
You may remember seeing Terry a few years ago on Clark County street corners, getting people to pay attention to drug addiction.
Tired of sitting on my behind, doing nothing, wishing for a lot, but nothing was happening.
According to the National Safety Council, the numbers are getting worse. In 1992, nearly 70,000 people died from preventable deaths. 25 years later, in 2017, that number nearly doubled. The odds of dying from accidental opioid overdose is 1 in 96, and for car deaths, the odds were 1 in 103.
I'm not surprised at all. I'm sickened by it, but I'm not surprised.
Terry hopes her story and these statistics will open people's eyes about the widespread threat that no one likes to talk about.
Get rid of it, just come home. Everybody's waiting.
Another sad story.
They're all sad stories.
Yeah.
There is not a happy story. Once in a while you find one, you will mix one in, but they're, for the vast majority, sad story. I'm going to tell you about my story coming up soon. Attorney General Stein, thank you very much.
Eric,
Senator Davis, thank you guys very much. Keep the fight up, and if there's anything we can do, we will back you. I love seeing a bipartisan effort to attack the addiction. Thank you very much. So we've talked to lawmakers. Next, treating the addiction. We're going to talk with a local nurse who's also the medical director and co-founder of a program just for pregnant and parenting women. We'll be right back.
I was 16 years old. I was actually traveling abroad, had a headache, was just really uncomfortable.
That's when Courtney Lowry's addiction started.
My mother had some of her opioid pain medication that she had for various aches and pains that she shared with me, and that sharing culture that we see that starts a lot of this. And it was all very innocent.
For about the next 15 years,
it was a steady decline and roller coaster.
Lowry fought against drug and alcohol addiction.
I'll celebrate 4 years of sobriety on November 8th.
Also celebrating more awareness about opioid addiction with local doctors like Scott Donaldson in Hendersonville.
They got to beg me for the narcotics.
Decreasing the amount of opioid prescriptions given out.
I've probably written 2 in the last 4 months, maybe. But probably less.
Compare that from around 2 years ago.
So a conservative estimate, probably 1,200 pills I was putting out on the street every month.
A report from North Carolina Health News says patients reported doctors telling them that they cut down on opioid prescriptions from fear of medical board sanctions or because of new state laws combating the length of prescriptions for patients.
I would think that it's just more data out there how people don't need these narcotics.
a lesson Lowry says she learned firsthand.
I think there's a place for opioid medications, but there's a real fine line, and we have to be responsible about making sure that they fall in their proper place.
Prescription painkillers are now the most deadly drugs in America, and they might be sitting right next to you in your medicine cabinet. Emily Baucom shows you the agony of opioid addiction and the culture change some doctors are now making to save lives.
Opioid hell.
Nobody is happy to be an addict, not one person.
Valerie McDonald lived it for 6 years.
I just said I was in pain.
Doctor shopping to get her fix.
I was up to about 50 painkillers a day, and I know that sounds really intense and crazy, but it's not for somebody that's taking them all day, every day.
Opioids gave her intense euphoria, and she chased it, eventually getting hooked on heroin and hitting rock bottom.
I lost my house, my car, my job, my daughter, all in like 1 week.
Sadly, doctors hear stories like this several times a day. Pain management specialist Dr. Prabdeep Graywal knows the warning signs.
There's a lot of fixation on my pills, I need my refill.
She's at the forefront of a culture change. Doctors shying away from prescribing pills that simply mask pain.
It's a matter of stepping back to see what else is there, what else is causing their pain.
Dr. Graywal weans her patients off pills and encourages physical therapy to identify the source of pain and improve quality of life.
And over a period of 6 months, when you see the change in that patient's relationships with their families and their ability to get up and move around and not necessarily rely on this wheelchair, it's a rewarding experience. You can sleep at night.
This is my old room.
After her overdose, McDonald moved into Alpha Home, a sober living facility for women. She got clean, got her daughter back, and now runs her own sober living homes.
I had to have somebody show me it was possible.
She's one of the few lucky ones, you see, who climbed out of opioid hell.
The one girl that was beside me in this bed, she's in prison. And then the other one is, one of them died, and then the other one is not sober.
A sobering reminder of the toll addiction takes.
Why did God spare me? Because I know these other girls wanted it too.
I'm Emily Baucom reporting.
And you just saw the national opioid crisis is devastating families nationwide. First Lady Melania Trump joined me in November for a special town hall at Liberty University. She says she's visited addicts, babies born addicted, and families impacted by addiction across the country.
What has struck me with each visit is how this epidemic has touched so many people, whether it is because of personal use or that of family members, friends, co-workers, or neighbors.
One resource in Western North Carolina to help in the fight against opioid addiction is the Mountain Area Health Education Center, or MAHEC. Joining us now is Melinda Ramage. She's the MAHEC director and also the medical director and co-founder of Project CARA. Melinda, tell us a little bit about, well, let's start with MAHEC. I think this is really important work you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. So I think one of the things that we're talking a lot about is prescribing practices, and what MAHEC as a health education training facility is dedicated to is evidence-based training of medical providers, from the physician to the nurse practitioner to the nurse to the medical assistant. And when you think about what educational opportunities we have in medicine historically to learn about addiction, the average medical...
What don't we know? What's the most recent breakthrough you've learned?
Well, we've learned that we are not training our providers to know anything about addiction when they graduate from any of their trainings. The average medical medical student has less than 8 hours of training on addiction. And so when we talk about safe prescribing, we have to also talk about, hey, we want you to know what is the disease of addiction, how to identify it, how to treat it, just like we do with every other chronic medical disease.
So we were talking a little bit, and you saw First Lady Melania Trump talking about one of her core issues is a baby's born addicted to opioids.
Yes.
Tell us how this happens.
Yes, well, I have good news. Babies are not born addicted. Thankfully, they are born with a risk of neonatal abstinence syndrome. And so I think that terminology is real important for the option of hope, right? So at our practice, we are the OB safety net provider, Project CARA, for the Western region. And our goal is to have an open door for women who are pregnant using substances. The First Lady in that talk at Liberty talked a lot about the shame about seeking help for addiction. And the pregnant woman, never in addiction world is they're more stigmatized of a population than the pregnant woman.
I will tell you that what we've found so far, I think we've done 4 of these town halls and panels and roundtables. One of the big issues is how do you remove the stigma of addiction, and that will allow people to go get help, and they're not fear that they're going to get thrown out of school or punished by their parents or fired.
Right. So we've learned that 70% of women who are pregnant with a substance use disorder will tell their obstetrician or their OB care provider first. So that's one of our charges at MAHEC and Project CARA, is to make sure that we are creating and supporting providers to be safe spaces so that I can come tell you, hey, I'm pregnant and I'm struggling, and you don't call the police and you don't call DSS, and we're going to work together to find where you can get help and resources.
And the reason why I keep talking to the camera, because what we know now, 72,000 people died last year of drug overdoses, but literally hundreds of thousands of people are addicted or becoming addicted to these opioids that are killers. So get help. Look at the resources we're providing you, these phone numbers we're providing you, we'll continue to provide you throughout the show, at the end of the show as well, resources to get help. I really want to talk about something that our Facebook viewers are really in tune with. Kratom. Talk to us about what Kratom is and the effectiveness and dangers of it.
So first off, we do not know enough about Kratom. Kratom is a botanical or a plant-based opioid agonist. So that means if I take the leaves of the Kratom plant and chew on it, I'm going to get a response chemically in my body that is similar to a mild opioid. Used predominantly in Southeast Asia. We're seeing it come across to us, whether it be on the internet and head shops, and they're not FDA regulated. So the problem with Kratom is I don't know actually what you're getting. I don't know how potent it is, and I don't know what else is in it. When we look at...
Is it addictive?
It sure can be, because it's still working on the same receptor that the other opioids are.
So you may be trading one addiction for another addiction.
Well,
possibly.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other catch is a lot of folks, as we, we talked already about our worry about when we just drastically stop pills, and what does that mean for people who still have addiction looking to heroin. People are using Kratom to help withdraw. And so how do we recognize that and really best support and get access for those folks?
So what about methadone? Tell us, so many studies tell us methadone works, helps people ease off cravings and addictions, but also some people say it doesn't work. It's a false
trading one for another, right, is what we hear a lot. So the evidence says that medication-assisted treatment, so that is buprenorphine and methadone, works. It does work. In fact, it works so much that our governing bodies in obstetrics, so the American College of Obstetric and Gynecology and the American Society of Addiction Medicine, both say it works so well in changing outcomes that it is recommended in pregnancy if you have opioid use disorder.
They're recommending taking methadone
or buprenorphine in pregnancy
in place of an opioid.
Correct.
They say it's not addictive, but is it?
So, I mean, we could argue that almost anything could be addictive,
right.
But absolutely. So methadone is an opioid.
Can
it is a
people overdose on
long-acting
methadone?
They can.
Yes, they can.
Yeah.
So what's the point?
Yeah, so the point is getting your life back. So if we really look at this as a chronic medical illness that has a chemical base, the idea behind methadone and buprenorphine is to calm that screaming voice that wakes up the second you do, that says, we want that drug and we want it now, and to calm it down so that you actually can then
reduce your craving, but it doesn't eliminate your craving.
It reduces it.
You crave this instead of the other.
The hope is you don't have cravings, so that you can go through your day and get into treatment.
And again, I'm not an expert. Very quickly, just give me 20 seconds. Has anyone ever died of an overdose of kratom?
25 people from July 2016 to July 2017 in the United States. 25? Yes, sir.
Yet 72,000 died from opioid overdoses. Something we need to really look at if kratom is working and being, fewer people are dying. Melinda, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Law enforcement, your police, deputies, and state troopers also have an important role in curbing the opioid crisis. Next, the efforts from a police chief to keep more people out of jail and off opiates.
Modulated continuous wave signal.
Inside this complex problem, using a cell phone app to get people help when they need it most.
In essence, saving lives.
That's a hope.
To do that, this app called Second Chance uses inaudible sound signals or sonar to monitor someone's breathing rate and movements from up to 3 feet away to help track when an opioid overdose happens. If a person's breathing slows down or stops, the app sends an alarm to ask the person if they're okay. If that person doesn't respond, the app can alert someone for help.
This is potentially one solution to a part of it, to sort of keep people safe until they're able to access treatment. You can't access treatment if you're not alive.
To test the algorithm behind the app, researchers partnered with Insight, a supervised injection site in Vancouver, British Columbia. On average, the algorithm correctly identified breathing problems that can lead to an overdose 90% of the time.
Our goal is to make it more and more accessible to people to use the app.
Researchers are now in the initial process of applying for FDA approval. The hope is to make the app available to the masses within the next year and a half.
It's something that's on your phone, so it's nothing that can identify you, and so there's no stigma associated with it.
Using technology to help save lives and create an avenue for additional help. Right now, the app has only been tested on those who use illegal substances. Deaths from those overdoses are the most common.
It's heartbreaking to think that someone could, pass away and maybe have a smartphone in their pocket that could, potentially help them.
A big issue in the fight against opioids is how these deadly drugs are getting on the streets. They're not just coming from drug dealers on the corners. The DEA says they're also rampant on the black market. As Yami Version explains, many people buying these underground pills are average folks who got addicted after an injury.
A black market usually created by injury or surgery. A black market for small pills that can prove to be deadly. Little pills causing big problems. The black market for prescription meds being fed by stolen pills, stolen prescription scripts, and people who need to make a quick buck or
maybe a physician who's overprescribing to somebody and then maybe getting some sort of kickback from that. That's probably a little bit more of the rarer of a physician getting a kickback from overprescribing.
Sold in various ways in a much different style.
And that could be sold in a parking lot, a classroom, anywhere. I mean, when you're dealing with something like that.
Unlike other drugs, opioid addiction is usually the result of a physical ailment.
There's individuals who become addicted for this, not by choice, but because they're recovering from some sort of injury or surgery or something, and now they were not properly weaned off of the narcotic.
Not difficult to believe after looking at data collected by the CDC or Centers for Disease Control. In our area, Atascosa County, 84 out of 100 people have a prescription medication for opioids. That's just under one prescription per person.
In Western North Carolina, Haywood and McDowell counties both have law enforcement assisted diversion, that's called LEAD programs. These programs allow officers to redirect low-level offenders to community-based programs and services instead of jail. We have Chief Bill Hollingsed with us from Waynesville Police Department. His department recently implemented a LEAD program. Thank you, Chief, for being here. Tell us a little bit about LEAD and what you strive to do with LEAD.
What we looked at is very early on, we saw a number of people in our community that became addicted to these pills, just like the reporter had mentioned, due to a legitimate medical need initially. That legitimate medical need rolled into an addiction. Too often we saw that addiction end up in opioid overdose and often death. So we looked at what was causing these people to commit some of these low-level crimes, whether it's the possession of the pills or a shoplifting to fuel their addiction. We looked at programs across the country and really kind of focused on the LEAD program, which if we can take an individual that the only reason they're in the community committing these low-level crimes is to feed that addiction, we hope to break the cycle of addiction to break their cycle of criminality.
Talk to us a little. I think this is very important. I think we have a full screen showing this. Narcan or Noxolone is a reversal drug. Mm-hmm. Do all your officers have access to Narcan?
We do. Since 2014, every police officer, every deputy sheriff, every law enforcement officer in Waynesville and in Haywood County have been issued naloxone. And since then, we've had hundreds of law enforcement reversals across our state. We've had close to 1,500 law enforcement reversals, and that doesn't include the numbers that EMS is providing the community as well.
One of the things I think is important for us to realize, and I've seen this, I didn't want to be this expert. I've seen Narcan work. Someone who's severely overdosing gets administered intravenously, or I think they can even do it nasally as well now, 1 or 2 doses of Narcan, and it's like they've just woken up.
It is. We've actually, not to be terse about it, but we call it Jesus in a bottle at times, because it literally, somebody can be the color of my uniform shirt and 1 or 2 hits of naloxone or Narcan can bring that person back. And it doesn't take a long time to do. It's almost instantaneous.
I don't know why every law enforcement officer doesn't have it in his car. I don't know why every school has it in every classroom. I don't know why every job site has it on their job sites as well. It really
and that is something we have been working with the community colleges, job sites throughout our community to put naloxone in those locations because often, obviously, they are the first ones there long before
you're on the
EMS
front lines,
get
Chief.
there.
You're on the front lines. Let's talk. Tell me. Here's what I hear about naloxone a lot. You're enabling bad behavior. If an addict knows that he or she could be saved with a dose of Narcan, they may tend to do more things. Is that an accurate statement?
We don't look at it that way. We provide all the tools and resources we can to our officers to save lives, no matter what that means. They also carry AEDs in the cars, and we don't ask them for their dietary history or how many heart attacks they've had before we administer an AED.
That being for diabetes, someone going into diabetic shock.
Or heart attack, where that AED can bring that person back. Our job is, again, to provide tools, resources for our officers to save lives, and we're not going to be in a position of judging how the person got to that position.
It's a great analogy. You don't ask a person what if they're having a heart attack why they ate so much red meat over the last 10 years. You save the person, and then they can work on their lifestyle after.
And we go a step further. After, if we respond to that overdose and are able to save a life there, reverse that overdose, we follow up with that individual. We go back to the home once they've gotten out of the hospital and try to get them into treatment. We have an overdose follow-up
Chief,
program.
allow me to do this. We have, first of all, that North Carolina Medical Board number, again, 800-253-9653. We had some people on the street who had a question. I think this is very interesting. Take a listen.
David Sailors from Trenton, Georgia. So where are the drugs coming from?
There it is. There it is. Where are they coming from? A lot of people say, how does a problem in North Carolina, where does it start?
Very early on in the crisis, we saw a lot of people leaving our state and going to the pill mills. They can go down and correct. That's where it initiated, and Florida's done a great job on quelling those pill mills. But that's where we saw the majority of the pills coming. Obviously, there's a lot of pills prescribed in our state, so people initially are getting pills legally. There's the black market, we've heard, where people can order pills from overseas and have them shipped directly here. So there's a number of areas that people can get pills. Unfortunately, with our very young people, we as parents and we as grandparents have become the #1 drug dealers to our kids because they can get those pills in our medicine cabinets. So we're in a education program to educate our community to get those pills out of your medicine cabinets. We've given thousands of med safes to safe.
Is there a hotspot? Is there a hotspot within North Carolina where if your kid is hanging out in this area, there's a good chance they're up to no good?
Sure, and we look at those different hotspots. HIDTA does a great job of providing that information for us. The epidemic really started in more rural communities. That's why they called it hillbilly heroin. That was the name of the opioids initially 10, 12 years ago. We saw it in the rural centers, and now of course it's a crisis everywhere.
Anywhere else outside of the state that you see trafficking going on?
Sure, just about every state in the union has an opioid
specifically
problem.
for North Carolina and maybe even Asheville area.
Sure, we follow the pattern as far as going to Atlanta, different places. It's a wide variety of places. Every community has prescribers, and every community has pharmacies, and so there's a supply of pills in every community across our country.
Very quickly, I only have about 30 seconds or so. Can you tell us what you've seen changing over? You've been a chief for a better part of 20 years. What's changed in recent years?
Law enforcement goes through these changes. I started in law enforcement in the 80s and 90s in Florida, where we saw crack cocaine. We dealt with meth here. We still deal with meth, but the large labs. Now we saw 10, 12 years ago, we saw a number of people being addicted to these pills. It's now morphed into heroin because heroin is so much cheaper than pharmaceuticals.
Chief, I'm going to say thank you very much. We could talk about this for ad nauseum. This is a very, very bad problem. I didn't want to be this voice. My son Eric Chase, a sophomore at University of Colorado, bought an illegal fentanyl-laced Xanax. He never woke up from it. So I have two comments to make, and I do this across the country. I don't care if you've heard it before. One pill can kill, kids. If you take a pill, you don't know what it's going to do. To parents, your kid may not be what you think he is. He will or she will see opioids. Good night, everybody.